This is my colleague, Paula Atkinson from Washington, D.C., and she's here at the Mood Disorder Support and Education Group, which is from North Carolina. Bye! How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm so honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So basically, we want to know from your area of expertise, which is a lot about eating disorders and body positivity and body justice, like any of those things that relates to mood disorders, right?
Yeah.
And and the suffering that we all associate with mood disorders, either directly feeling mood disorders or loving someone who has a mood disorder.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great. I've been thinking about this a lot since you asked me, which I'm again very honored to be a part of this. I don't know how much of my podcast you heard. So I treat eating disorders or disordered eating or quote unquote body image issues from a social justice standpoint, from and a trauma informed standpoint, which mean by that I mean um, recognizing that to be sane around food and bodies in our culture is relatively impossible, because our culture is absolutely toxic when it comes to food and bodies. And we have been brainwashed for about 100 years now to believe that big bodies are inferior to small bodies. We've been brainwashed for about 100 years now to believe that everybody can and should have a small body, and that is scientifically impossible, not true, that not all bodies can be small, and nor should people try. Um, and what's true is that bodies just come in different shapes. And those shapes change throughout your life, and those shapes change for lots of reasons. But the idea that there's good ones and there's bad ones, and the good ones are small, and I would add white, and the bad ones are large, and I would add brown. That's all part of the culture. So when people come to me with body image issues, what I like to explain is that you don't have a body image issue. What you have is internalized fat phobia from a very, very sick culture. And that's not your fault. You come by it honestly, because our culture is really sick. And it's mostly about capitalism, and about making money, because the diet industry has told us that we can and should all be the same shape. And so what they sell us is starvation. And then your body has a biological response to starvation, which is eating maybe more than your body needs. And your body's biological response to starvation is getting bigger, such that if there's another famine, we will survive it. And then capitalism sells you more starvation, and you do it over and over and over your whole life. And then we blame fat people for being fat. Um, so that's my standpoint. That's how I work with people. When it comes to mood disorders, the thing that I've been thinking about since my beloved Cindy asked me to come and be with you guys is specifically around food and eating and starvation. And I think one of the things that is not talked about enough is that starvation is trauma. And we call starvation dieting in our culture, but your body doesn't know whether you are restricting nutrition so that you can look cute in a bikini, or you're restricting nutrition because there's a famine. And either one, to your body, it is trauma. And to recover from the trauma of starvation takes years, and it takes a lot of work. And when it comes to mood, and it comes to feeling or being relatively sane in one's body, to have food be regular, and to be listening to or regulated, right? To be getting constant, consistent nutrition is so important. And I've had so many clients come to me who thought that they had severe depression or severe anxiety disorders or severe whatever. And it turns out when they just started eating food regularly, it turns out they didn't have, and some people did have a mood disorder, and we worked with that. But definitely when we're toying around with starvation, and in a culture that says that when you're starving or when you're hungry, you're doing it right, that it can be so harmful for all bodies, and it can be really harmful for people who are maybe trying to regulate their moods with meds, maybe trying to regulate their moods without meds. I don't know if you've been very hungry lately, but you can't be hungry. I always say you can't be hungry and sane at the same time, right? Like we do not talk about in our culture, we do not talk about the healing effect of just eating normal, consistent, moderate meals. And in cultures where you eat with the family and mealtime is a sacred time, those are the places in the world where there's far less eating disorders, there's far less mental health issues, and the insanity that we participate in around food and body shape in our culture absolutely adds to all of the suffering and all of the mental health suffering that we have. So yeah, that's sort of what I've been thinking about, that we don't talk about how harmful dieting is, and not just harmful in the moment of dieting. Again, you can't be sane and starving at the same time, but then for years after that, you can still be suffering from the trauma of starvation. In the same way that I usually use like the example of, food, sleep, oxygen, water, right? These are things that you need to survive. If you restrict any of those, and specifically if you restrict any of those chronically, that is trauma to your body and to your brain. And so if you were restricted sleep chronically for a month, 2 months, it would take a long time for your body and brain to regulate when it came to sleep. And you'd probably always be a little bit obsessed with sleep, right? And that's the part too, that like so many of my clients come to me and they're like, I can't stop thinking about my body, or I can't stop thinking about food. And it's like, if you have ever been on a diet, that's your brain's biological response to starvation is the obsession with food and body. And so it takes a while for you to get over that. And in a culture that sells you diets, they don't want you to know that. Yeah. So that's sort of my take on it.
Wow. That's just not really ever been said in such a direct way.
Right.
Keep talking more. I know that there's issues about like what is nutrition and how that affects mood, but even attitude towards eating, that's not really discussed.
Yeah. Yeah, I am not a dietitian, right? So I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that the like you just said, Cindy, beautifully, like the attitudes and the shame around eating or eating the wrong things or all of that, that's so much more harmful to you and your body than whatever food you are eating, right? Like the shame around Oreos is far worse for your body and, and your health than Oreos themselves. Your body knows what to do with Oreos. Your body's like, great, thank you. Energy, got it, cool, moving on, right? But whatever mental obsession or shame you have around having eaten the Oreos, that is far worse for you and for your sanity, and also for the sanity of people around you who may want to enjoy eating the Oreos. So don't be that guy.
One of the challenges, particularly with the population that I work with, a lot of folks have to take medicines that
Mm-hmm.
do seem to create changes in the body.
Yep.
And so there's a big level of distress that they have to take something that they don't have control of its effect on the body, and then they get all of the stigma.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. I have, I've had several clients who also, had to take medication so that they could feel saner walking through the world, and it made their bodies bigger. And it breaks my heart. And I'm sure you've seen this, Cindy, right? It breaks my heart when there is a consideration of like, no, I'd rather live in a smaller body and be suffering, which is crazy when you think about it, than live in a bigger body and be living with how painful it is between my ears. Um, and I wish I could come here and cure fat phobia in our culture, but what I can say is like the health, quote unquote, effects of being fat um are not nearly as bad as what it's like to live live as a member of a marginalized group. And people in large bodies are members of marginalized group. And there's study after study after study that shows that, like, I can give some more resources to Cindy that she can send to you guys. But like a great book to start with is called Health at Every Size, written by Lindo Bacon, who is a doctor in San Francisco. And they wrote it over a decade ago now, and over and over they go through all of the studies that show that, like, if you're fat, you're going to die. And what it shows is when you control for things like economic class, when you specifically when you control for stigma, and you can as best you can, and you control for what it's like to be stigmatized, the health effects of a lot of or a little bit more adipose tissue on one's body completely goes away, because it's really, and we know this from studies on people of color, in psychological communities, we call it weathering, that, right, there are health effects of being a member of a marginalized group. And what we know is that for fat people, or however they identify, I use the word fat, that to be a member of that group, to live in a big body and to be oppressed, to be stigmatized, and then to be full of your own shame is far worse for your health than weighing more, than having adipose tissue on your body. So I try to explain that to clients, right? I wish I could take away the stigma that they feel when their body gets bigger from taking life-saving meds, right? If I had 1,000 hours, I would tell you all the stories that I've heard from clients who, I just had a client who was experiencing health issues, was decided to go on meds for her mood disorder. Her body got bigger. She went to a doctor, and the doctor tried to put her on medication for diabetes. She does not have diabetes, but the medication might make her lose weight, but it also is a stimulant. And my client said, first of all, I had anorexia when I was a kid. Second of all, I'm on meds for a mood disorder. And the medical doctor still tried to put her on stimulants to make her body smaller. And it's so infuriating, so infuriating.
I want to hear the term that you're using to describe the tissue. I'm not familiar with that
Oh,
term.
adipose tissue.
Say that
That's
more.
ADIPOSE. That's just a fancy word for fat.
Yeah, but it does have a descriptive element and less
Hmm.
of the associated the
Right.
word fat. And I was thinking to hear more about what you're saying with fat phobia, just all that's associated with that. And I also was thinking about sort of a slang PHAT, fat.
Uh-huh.
How
Totally.
that's kind of cool
Yeah.
that our culture has. So say some more about the fat phobia piece.
Sure. I don't know what to say. I mean, I can tell you, let's see. I
Tall,
can
short.
Oh, that's right. The reason I use the word fat is because um uh to me it's just a descriptor. There are negative connotations because of our culture's history of fat phobia, which is about, like I said, about 100 years now. Before that, being fat was the same as being tall. And in fact, it was, you know, more than 100 years ago, it was seen as a sign of wealth, a sign that you had a lot of food and you had people that did your manual labor for you. So you're obviously doing good in this world. So I use the word fat, and I throw it around a lot on purpose, just to sort of destigmatize the word, because it's not a bad word, and it doesn't, all of the things that we're taught that it connotes, like laziness or moral inferiority or lack of character or lack of willpower, it doesn't actually mean any of those things any more than tall means those things, or any more than having a certain color skin means those things, right? Like it's none of that's actually real. The idea that you can tell somebody's moral character by looking at the size of their body is nonsense, right? Like that's not real. But we, you know, we have been brainwashed to believe such things, to the extent that we will, like you were saying, Cindy, a lot of us will completely sacrifice our mental health in order to have a small body, such that we will, you know, other people will think that we're superior to somebody in a large body.
There was a question about, you know, the different kinds of eating disorders.
Yeah,
So, you know, from a restrictive versus a binge,
yeah,
just a little bit about how some of that might, just to educate us a little bit about that.
sure.
Particularly, I think there's right now, because of pandemic, there's, you know, this kind of eating more because we're distressed. And
Yeah,
you know, any one of those topics you can cover, but just keep going.
sure, of
Just keep
course.
going.
So yeah, so you know, most of us know, like, there's anorexia, there's bulimia, there's binge eating disorder, right? Anorexia is, and these are all like according to insurance companies, this is what these things mean, right? Like anorexia is eating less than your body needs, such that your body is starving, which, just as a side note, in the DSM, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, for good or for bad, um, is linked to a body weight, which is horrific, because there's a lot of people who have anorexia whose bodies never get small. Again, going back to my point before, that the idea that we can and all should have small bodies is scientifically false. Not all bodies can be small. And then bulimia is eating a lot of food and then getting rid of it in certain ways. We mostly know about purging, throwing up, but there's also exercise bulimia, like compulsively exercising, or laxative use. Those are all considered forms of bulimia too. And then binge eating disorder, which is eating more food than one's body needs, in sort of episodes of eating. So the way that we have all been taught that these are separate things, I am here to tell you that it's all the same. It's all the same. There's no difference, because everybody who starves binges, everybody who binges starves, everybody's doing all of the things. And so these categories that we have are completely for insurance companies. They're also completely a form of fat phobia, because binge eating disorder was only seen as a disorder within the last 5 years, which means the rampant fat phobia within the medical and the psychological communities meant that if somebody was starving to death, then they deserved mental health treatment. But if somebody's just eating too much, they just need to get their shit together. Excuse my language. So what I know, and the way I treat eating disorders, is that the basis of all of these is starvation. The basis of all of these is that this person went on a diet. And the way I always say it is, not everybody that goes on a diet gets an eating disorder, but nobody has an eating disorder without going on a diet. In the same way that nobody's an alcoholic unless they took a drink, right? If you never take a drink, you'll never be an alcoholic. If you never go on a diet, you'll never have an eating disorder. And so the basis of all of these is somebody went on an eating disorder, and most likely somebody went on a diet, and most likely this person was put on a diet when they were very young, or they chose to be on a diet when they were very young. And then what comes of that is starvation, quote unquote overeating, quote unquote, you know, all of these things, for the rest of their life unless somebody intervenes. Um, so that's the truth about eating disorders, is that, you know, there's the trauma of starvation, there's the initial traumatic event, which is starvation, and then out of that comes you know, and eating disorders can manifest different ways all the time. Like I said, people who are diagnosed with binge eating disorder are usually starving during the day, and then they quote unquote binge at night. You know, people with anorexia are usually binging too. It's just that they're binging on like terrible foods like lettuce and fat-free Jello, or awful things that nobody should be eating. You know, these categories and these clear distinctions between these disorders is not accurate when you actually look at the data of what people who are suffering are actually doing.
Because you're pinned, people can't maybe see my face, but my eyes are big, my mouth is open. I'm just like just I think your podcast, We're Still Hungry, which is
Yeah.
a radical podcast. I think I'll tell people to listen to the the article on the couch and then go to your podcast and see
That's
just
probably a good place to
the
start.
great irreverence that's there. But I am still hungry. I want to keep learning. I'm interested in some of the pandemic related eating
Yeah.
patterns of
Yeah.
that I notice in myself and others have
Totally.
spoken of. So what can you share with us about that?
I'm happy to talk about this. This is my favorite topic right now. Yeah, I think you know, there's been so first of all, eating is inherently comforting. You know, eating is inherently emotional. Eating is so great. It's so soothing. It's so wonderful. You know, not only is food just delicious and makes us feel good, but it's also impossible to be in a state of fight, flight, freeze and be eating at the same time. Biologically, you cannot do both of those things. So you like, and it goes back to like being on your mother's breast, and like, you know, you can't be in a state of like hyperactive sympathetic nervous system and be eating at the same time. So yeah, we're all eating more. Great, good for us. We're in a global pandemic. It's a terrible time. Good for you. So the idea that none of us should be emotionally eating is such diet culture nonsense. It's so ridiculous. Like, go to Italy and tell them they shouldn't be emotionally eating. That's so dumb. Of course, eating is emotional. It's inherently emotional. And so to allow yourself that, and again, going back to what I said before about the food themselves, are, you know, the actual nutrition or lack of nutrition of a Cheeto is not nearly as bad for you as the shame and the obsession that you have about it. It's the same with this. You know, a lot of bodies have gotten bigger during the pandemic. How can it be bad if all of our bodies have gotten bigger and we're still alive? How can it be bad? We're all survived it. We're surviving it. And all of our bodies have gotten a little rounder, all of our bodies have gotten a little softer, but we're here. And if you told your great great grandmother, well, I survived a global pandemic, but I'm really sad because my butt's a little bigger, she'd be like, what are you talking about? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. So I believe in the wisdom of our bodies. I believe in the wisdom of all the bodies that have survived this far. And if they're a little bit rounder and we all have to buy softer pants, marvelous, wonderful, great. Who cares?
This is what I love about you. Just the radical, put it out there, you know,
Yeah.
of something that just isn't said. Who are some people that we can also kind of look to, artists wise or musicians,
Yeah.
that you like, that we can start looking at to, you know, go the other way?
Yeah.
You know, how do we start filling that in our eyes and in our psyche?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So you may love, there's a musician here in DC called Heather May, and she is a fat queer folk singer, and she has a mood disorder, and she sings about it, and she writes songs about it, and she's really magical, and I love her. So it's Mae, Heather May. So I highly recommend her. Um, uh, you know, the cool thing I want to say before I give you some recommendations is that like you can change your brain if you you know, they did a study at the University of Texas about Instagram, which is, you know, like can be trash, but also if you curate your feed really, really well, you can change your brain and you can alter your brain's ideas about fat phobia. If you look at fat bodies a lot, you know, you stop believing that fat bodies are wrong or bad or ugly or disgusting or whatever. Beauty is learned, right? And so we've all been brainwashed to believe that beauty is thin and white, but that's not true, and you can actually change your brain. So by all means, my favorite thing to tell, like when I first have a session with a client, I tell them to follow the hashtags like fat positive, fat is beautiful, body justice, body liberation, fat liberation, and start, you know, start filling your eyeballs full of beautiful fat bodies. And once you do that, it really is, it's so good for you. It's so good for us all to see different bodies than just like thin, young, white people. Thin, young, white people are overrated. Oh, in terms of recommendations, like Virgie Tovar, Virgie Tovar, Tovar. She has a cute little book called "You Have the Right to Remain Fat," and it's great. It's short. It's funny. She's really, really great. You can follow her on Instagram too. I love her. If you excuse my language, if you struggle with your relationship with food, the Fuck It Diet is a great book that introduces you to intuitive eating, but in a really sarcastic, funny way. There's also, my colleague wrote The Anti-Diet, which is a really great book. Rebecca Stritchfield, she is here in Washington, D.C. And there's, if you want to get more into like intuitive eating and move away from diet culture and diet thinking, diet mentality, Food Psych is a great podcast. That's with Christy Harrison. But yeah, there's a lot out there now. It's so great. So many people are doing incredible work. If you want to know more about the history of fat phobia, a woman named Sabrina Strings, who's a professor at UCLA, wrote a book called "Fearing the Black Body," about how fat phobia is inherently racist, and fat phobia comes from white supremacy, because when the idea that thin bodies are the good bodies came from when Europeans are trying to distinguish themselves from non-Europeans. And so to be fat phobic is to be racist. Isn't that a great reason not to be fat phobic? So yeah, so that's really, really fascinating. Yeah.
Can you just say one more time about body positivism versus body justice?
Yeah.
Just one. I just want to hear it one more time.
Yeah, of course. So this is hard for people, I think. So first of all, the fat acceptance movement started in the 60s. It was actually part of the civil rights movement. And then we lost it because of the 80s. and then within social media, body positivity sort of usurped fat acceptance movement, and then was sort of taken by capitalism, right? And you might see now that there are more bigger bodies out in the world, which is great, and there's more representation of bigger bodies than there used to be, which is great. It's just that it's still very white, and it's still very beautiful people. It's like beautiful fat people and it's still not it's not a social justice movement, right? So body justice and body liberation is about social justice. It's about the fact that people in large bodies are stigmatized, are marginalized, are oppressed. Whereas body positivity, there's no real movement there other than everybody's body is beautiful, which is not bad at all, like great, wonderful, marvelous, but there's no real goal. There's no real higher I don't know, aspirate. It's not really aspirational, other than like everybody gets to love their body, which I love. But body justice and body liberation is about that all bodies that exist in this moment are perfect. All bodies that exist deserve respect. Nobody should be marginalized or oppressed based on something as silly as the shape of their body. That makes sense?
Yeah, one comment said from Jeff, noticing how most all the cutting edge thinkers forwarding the body positivity they've been mentioned thus far are women, and are all
Yeah.
men lost.
No, of course not. No, there's actually so many more. If you go, if you want to follow Rad Fat Men on Instagram, there's so many more than there used to be. Um, there haven't been any that have written any books yet, but we need them. we we want them. There's actually a guy here in Washington D.C. His name is Andrew Whalen, and I think it's Whalen, and he has a book coming out about being a man with an eating disorder and treating men with eating disorders. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So I'm glad you brought that up, Jeff. No, men are not lost.
I love it. So, what I'm going to do is pause this and express great gratitude, and then I'll
Oh,
pause this, and then we'll leave some room just for easy questions so that people feel
great,
freer.
great.
Mwah, mwah, to be continued, please. So I'm going to pause or stop.